Hello everyone, today we talk about Guelphs, Ghibellines and their intertwinement with the political, social transformation of the Italian communes, city-states, essentially in the second half of the 13th century. This is a crucial moment for the Italian communes as basically they developed in that proper statal form that we know better from. This was considered for a long time the peak of communal civilization, and in great part the peak of medieval civilization altogether. As you know, from the last decades of the century, the crisis kicks in Europe. There is a stagnation with not a recession, but it's unfair to consider the ensuing crisis, also in the broader European system, as necessarily a moment of involution of the political and institutional forms, and also of the military systems. And we will talk more properly about this in videos about the early 14th century, because that's where you can measure the thing better. But in a way, now we are also preluding at that, but we stop essentially to the golden age. And talking about Guelphs and Ghibellines is a big task that probably we will deal with more theoretically somewhere else. We have seen, generally speaking, what the meaning of this factional division between Guelphs from Welfen, that is the ducal dynasty at the time opposing Frederick Barbarossa in Germany, that is the pro-papals, and the Ghibellines from Weiblingen, that was the Hohenstaufen castle, the name of which was used as a battle cry by the Swabians. That is the pro-Imperial ones. In that case, they were the same Imperial dynasty. So, Guelph and Ghibelline are the Italianization of the two terms, respectively. And it occurred essentially in the second fourth of the 13th century to define the broader alliances that had formed among the Italian communes, who backed, in fact, respectively, the Holy Roman Imperial policy and the Papacy and its allies. Loosely, as we will see, these alliances actually overlapped with divisions and formations that had already been widely determined in Italian cities, independently from the conflict between papacy and empire. But this narrative also has been pushed sometimes too far, as to say, after all, the states really cared only about themselves. They didn't have any broader interest even in the consolidation of the papacy or the empire on them. And this is surely true by the degree, of course, of which the same Italian communes had fought and won actually against the Holy Roman Imperial attempt to consolidate a autocratic power in the peninsula. They would have never allowed the papacy to achieve the same objective, even though they accepted the broader Angevin hegemony that had followed the French conquest of the kingdom of Sicily, that was stripped from the Hohenstaufen, the heirs of the dynasty, and that had with Charles of Anjou acting fundamentally not just as king of Naples and lord of his French and also Balkan possessions, but also as a lord in some of these cities, but a type of lordship that was mainly like the conferment of some military prerogatives in exchange for the maintenance of the autonomies, right? That had been the big topic actually during the wars against Frederick Barbarossa and Frederick II, because that's where it had gotten to. The reason why these, but again, the cities themselves had never actually thought to live in a world without empire, without papacy, and as we will see now, there is some, especially from the Ghibelline side, an actual ideological conviction that was at the base, after all, the same role of the empire, and went back to some important beliefs that were still alive at the time. We are already past, in a sense, the peak of universalism. You can embody it in Frederick II. So after 1250, the Italian communes had been free of any major, threat, invasion, and they would employ their enormous and unprecedented wealth at that point in history, not just to develop further political, but also to expand militarily. And in fact, the degree of warlikeness increased. Right, these lands are easily, if just one considers the quantities involved, the most militarily active in medieval Europe. There is no doubt about this, and this defines, in fact, the same state that we know eventually emerging from humanism in political theory and practice, that in fact differentiates the Italians properly, the Italian communes from the other European ones, because these were true states, right? They were not something overlapping with other forms of government or etc. They were literally entities that, aside from the nominal belonging to the empire, were de facto independent and would pursue their independence, in fact, in quite shrewd and opportunistic ways. And the reason why this topic is so important, in fact, one of the most overlooked in popular culture, I presume, is that the central northern Italian scenario here is becoming fundamentally the one in which the entire Western European political game rests its basis on. First of all, for the old reason that Italy was the crown to which the Holy Roman Imperial one was connected to, with the papal crowning. So without the support of the Italian city-states, you could not even reach Rome and not gaining the imperial title. This phase that we're looking at is also the one, incidentally, of the German interregnum that ended in the 70s with the crowning of Rudolf of Habsburg as King of the Romans. That was essentially this phase in papal history where the Angevins had between Naples and Mediterranean and Italy itself had become so powerful that the same papacy that had basically and literally exterminated biologically the Swabian male line and had carried out one of the most systematic and effective and devastating propaganda mechanisms against the empire, actually sided with the empire. So much that Charles of Anjou was also allied with Ottokar of Bohemia, the main opponent of Rudolf of Habsburg, etc. And from there on, the imperial dream would be kind of a broader Mediterranean policy. The reunification in East and West would be still counted on as a possibility by the German monarchs. Rudolf never had enough support and power in Germany to descend in Italy for the imperial crowning, and it was actually a clever thing and prudent thing in some ways, because the whole expedition was a huge gamble and an enormous risk in the first place. Later on, especially with Henry VII, and we've seen also last autumn something about the ideological dimension of this, with eventually Ludwig of Wittelsbach, the renewed clash with the papacy, the war in Lombardy, and this whole Guelph Ghibelline bloc thing, because again, these alliances were all supported locally by the Italian city-states, and would take place only fundamentally through their consent. And so the division factionally was of enormous importance, because in these generations, especially at this point, the Guelph hegemony in the peninsula was kind of evident. There were some Ghibelline communes that surely kept up with their own political and military capacity, but generally speaking, it's a moment of relative international stability as far as especially the Italian intervention were concerned. It's the Italians themselves that actually fight dramatically one against the other, and surely following some policies that were different, of course, from the mere pro-imperial, pro-papal line, but that still were always connected to them, and in ways that were always international, right? The idea here, this is, for example, the moment of the rise of foreign mercenaries in the peninsula. At this time, actually, the majority is Italian, but especially as far as, we see heavy cavalry, we realize that from the Guelph Angevin side, there is more of a French presence. From the Ghibelline Imperial side, there's more of a German presence. And this pattern will go on, actually, up to the 10s, the 20s of the 14th century, where at some point the mercenarism becomes ever more unhinged from the broader universal issues, also because empire and papacy will shrink dramatically with the 14th century crisis and so on. That's another issue. I made other videos on the rise of mercenarism in 14th century Italy. Made 2 videos, and there is also one in the military intervention in Italy during the 14th century from external powers. That is also instructive in the sense it's a bit prosecution of this video. At this point, what is important to realize is how, in fact, the Guelph-Ghibelline dichotomy was relevant and functional to the same internal development of the Italian communes, and what was their siding on the same base. The grouping of forces here is a big deal. The Italians were habituated to coalesce, militarily speaking, in leagues, right, as it's evident during the clash against the Hohenstaufen. The bigger one had been the Lombard one. There was also the Venetian one. That was another thing we'll say, but generally speaking, in the Po Valley, the communal phenomenon had started earlier, was at least had been stronger during the 12th and the 13th century. There was also a relative, contiguity, a greater connection, and older, also public understanding, let's say, of the political mechanisms in what had been the ancient Lombard kingdom, etc. And this favored, as we've seen in other videos, that there is an entire playlist that I created about the Italian communes. So if you're interested, you can go check that out. This had favored. So first of all, this league system, which entailed that every city sent. This was a military one, right? The Italian communes were founded essentially on, and you could argue solely on a military principle, right? The idea that these communities, even during the early Middle Ages, were of freemen in arms, and that was a nobility, literally, belonging. This is the ancient Roman Germanic ideal, the idea that the freeman is a nobleman, right? And the Italian communes had paraded this prerogative in ways that, in fact, were unknown, but part of the same reason why the communes were successful and also had the most developed infantry in Europe, etc., was that they had historically maintained, differently from north of the Alps, properly freedom in juridically and practically sanctioned, right? Whereas north of the Alps, everybody was somebody else's person, in a way or another. So these communes that would be, again, I made so many videos that explain, I won't repeat myself, but were loaded with a moral force that, in fact, is striking, even if you consider the sheer amount of troops and resources that could mobilize. We're talking easily about these leagues forming up armies of 30,000 men on a regular basis as the largest armies in Europe, right? At this point, actually the Italian military potential would expand fast. Only the Veronese lordship by the early 14th century had basically the second largest military in Europe alone, after the Kingdom of France, right? And this is not counting all the other Italian lordships together. So that gives you literally a measure of the shocking amount of wealth. I mean, and wealth that was not just accumulated by these republics over the centuries in the Mediterranean, also exploiting the Crusades, the dramatically favorable geographical position, the fertile soil, mild weather, all these things, but how many of these resources were actually burned in wars, right? An immense amount that, in fact, would be accomplished, like in other areas in Europe, to the exhaustion of the system at a certain point. And so cities that sent their own contingents to go fight a common enemy, and that for this reason, however, needed some sort of unity of command, right? And this increased over time so much that the first Italian lordships were born essentially in this function, right? They emerged mostly from podestas. The aforementioned Charles of Anjou also kind of was just one of the others, right? Even though he was the king of Naples and all, but he would act like a broader protector that would maintain a control over actually multiple cities, and this had started in Lombardy during, in fact, the mid-13th century. It was actually a Hohenstaufen system, right? Frederick II had brought, think about Umberto Pallavicino or Zellino da Romano, etc., that some of which were actually born wealth, and eventually would become Ghibellines as broader vicars, let's say imperial vicars properly. Some lands were strategically relevant for the imperial alpine crossing in the peninsula, all these things, and that had remained as lords of several cities at a time, which was advantageous for them individually because, of course, they could control more places, but at the same time, these places were, the more places were controlled at a time, the more these, the actual control on the single ones decreased in absolute terms. So it was quite advantageous for everybody, and the first motivation was an effort for pacification, because naturally these were, as we've seen, kind of mercantile republics. They were, let's say, that war is not a good idea for the economy, in part at least. They would pursue their political goals always in a military way, but there was indeed in part a cost that was evidently too high, and therefore the attempts of pacification, of finding some sort of stability, is at the same root of the future seigneuries, and also the practical possibilities of maintaining a control on these systems that were, again, pretty shattered by war after all, even though they were expanding fast. In fact, one of the greatest reasons of this instability was the same expansion, as in many contexts, historically speaking. When you have a big economical boom, then you have everybody says, oh well, okay, it's fine, we don't have to worry anymore. And then this boom provides with resources that start to many people at once, by the way, that manage to use them in an uncoordinated way, because that level of wealth has not existed previously. And so there is a kind of security measure that is tried, that is eventually enforced to maintain a greater authority and control and discipline. And we're actually living in pretty similar moments in the same, for the same reason. And all this passed through war, indeed. And the Guelph-Ghibelline dichotomy was perfect in a sense for such clash, because in a way and another, as we'll see now, you could even say left and right dichotomy were always present in a sense. And so the idea that the clash was bipolarized, even though there were not really two single poles, and this was evident in many ways, not just in the same Italian scenario, but also in the with the same papal and imperial power. There were many changes, many adjustments, as we were saying before, but it would still serve, right, to some broader function. Also because, again, these and this is overlooked today, and people say, oh no, it's not really like that, you can't say it. Yes, but it's a valid pattern interpretation as an approximation. It is to say the wealth party, let's say, was tendentially more democratic, was more popular, while the Ghibelline one was more aristocratic, more seigneurial. And you can easily understand how and why. I mean, the idea of and why they would correspond to papacy and empire respectively, because of course these, especially the mercantile classes that were becoming ever more important, as we will see, embodying the so-called Popo, the people, right? It was a real institution with a paramilitary organization that, especially in the narrow Italian city streets that were heavily fortified, etc., were quite a force to be reckoned, especially with even the functional specialization of infantry with pikes, crossbows, pavises, and all these things were anti-knightly in a way, and would in a sense, more than being pro-papal, as we were saying before, from an ideological point of view, they would mostly be anti-imperial, or at least they were the ones that would have had more to lose in terms of a more, of a stronger imperial power in the peninsula, because actually the same Italians had taken up arms sometimes after having literally been the same ones of calling the emperor at the beginning. Well, maybe there was a neighboring city that was harassing them. The case of Milan and Pavia historically with Barbarossa in 1154. But the emperors would basically want to strip them of any kind of income that they had enjoyed at that point. So it was not just the recognition of something like the Faldrum or it was literally a complete takeover, which the emperors wanted to achieve, because again, as we have explained many times, Italy was a massively better option to build an empire from, basically by any standard than Germany itself. It was more urbanized, more better administered, literate, richer, centralized, at least on the base of the cities. It was something completely different, and these had taken up arms. And so kind of the people, the infantries, right? So those who historically, even in Italy, were considered by the nobility inferior as commoners, right? As the Italian cities had developed their own nobility, their own the milites, as were called properly, the knights, that yes, everybody was free, but just, in practice, the noblemen were freer, as always, but still with this important communal presence that, in fact, would be importantly felt also on the battlefields. Think about, the resistance of the Lombard infantry at the Battle of Legnano after their own cavalry had broken and saved the day in time for the reinforcements to arrive and to crush the German cavalry. The same, even against Frederick II, the Battle of Cortenuova, the Italian infantry stood against the charges of Imperial cavalry for an entire freaking day without breaking. At Fossalta also, the infantry, the Lombard infantry, literally went ahead against the King of Sardinia. It was Frederick II's son, alone, without the support of cavalry, and facing cavalry. It was something unbelievable. Like, literally, nobody had done this in Europe before, right? Nobody had had the guts, the strength to actually face cavalry alone in open field as an infantryman and as a commoner in the first place. Right, it was from 2 centuries that infantry in the first place didn't win alone a single battle, right? And so these, the feats of these Lombard infantrymen showed Europe also in the other, subjugated classes of peasants, of bourgeois. Look at what can be done, something that nobody in the order of things in feudal Europe had thought this could be possible. The Italians showed the way, and they would also take it to the next step, at least not involving just infantry, as this is often a misguided criterion to evaluate the military effectiveness of a system. In ways that in the early 14th century, in fact, has been done rather too much, also very often in a teleological sense, as infantry as the arm of the future, but it's quite another thing, and I discussed this elsewhere. But this commoners, of course, were kind of more distant from the feudal imperial ideal, right, as opposed to the milites, to the knights that were somewhat like if an emperor had to come to rule there, would have surely entrusted them by cooptation some greater power than that would have allowed actually to subjugate the commoners better. And this was the aforementioned case of the vicars before of the lordships. It had been born in a way like this, albeit in a moment when, during Frederican times of Frederick II at least, the infantry, the commoners, the people had already began to fight within the city for their own prerogatives, and were starting to build up in ways that would, as we will see now, also overthrow the older militia, right? Whereas, in fact, the milites, as we've seen, were kind of more, even just by lifestyle, they were essentially like mobsters, like the most common, knightly mindset and military-wise was the idea that they were the ancient tribal idea of being free, right, of ruling the land from the top of their decree, to be the ones who had the greater prerogatives, that the communes paid for, also more for their, especially in fact for their mounts, for their weapons, when they were damaged in combat, all these things, and that were also, generally speaking, pretty violent, so much that the people were given that every once in a while there was this fights in the streets between the various gangs, military guilds and brotherhoods we'll see now of the knights. The people began to say, wait a minute, if my shop gets destroyed in the process, that's not quite a good thing. And that's also what partly had started the paramilitary organization of the same people. So in other ways, the Guelphs were siding with the papacy was kind of a more a less risky business. In many ways, the papacy would achieve a great military power, especially at the beginning of the 14th century. It would start trying to take over parts of Italy in the north and center, but it wouldn't succeed. And now it's complicated to explain, but in general, at this time, for a commoner, it was easier to side ideologically with at least the side of the papacy, right, without actually even too many ideological complications. Whereas the knights, the lords, etc., saw the international scenario. They had broader horizons, obviously. They had greater, longer range relations with each other, also abroad, etc. So they were kind of more prone to support an empire, to support a broader, universal power, at least some kind of higher order in the Italic kingdom, and not only. So again, always bearing in mind that a too heavy hand from the imperial side would have discontented all these groups, right? The knights fought against the emperors themselves, so they hadn't had problems at that point. And the communes were quite proud of this, because they had factually been recognized, as you know, at Constance by Frederick I, their own prerogatives. The same success against Frederick II was a big deal at that time. It was taking almost an apocalyptic nature. Later on, there were times of imperial coming back, such as under Manfred. I made a video about him in autumn. The same Conradin was objective at the last shot of the Owens staff, and to literally seize the kingdom of Sicily, and they were actually about to do it, right? If Charles of Anjou hadn't concealed himself with a reserve on the plain of the Palentinian, Palentinian plains, at the Battle of Tagliacozzo. So these shifts were a big deal, as you understand, because again, the entire French and German policy also rested on this balance. And what is fascinating about the struggle between Guelphs and Ghibellines is also that in such dichotomy was a way, a bit like it had been the older investiture controversy, a chance actually of civilizational development. Again, as we were saying before, these cities were booming economically, militarily, scientifically, artistically. The best of communal civilization is starting, it's happening here. And war, of course, was a defining tool of this too, because even the cleverness in a 30 independent cities system where you have to take a side and to maintain it and to kind of understand what was happening factually in all 30 of them and abroad, in other countries and in Mediterranean and so on, and within the city itself, politically and socially. Well, it is something that does develop civilization, and that, as we've seen, Italy was already starting kind of from an unadvantaged position. And this is the same Italy of Dante that we have seen, we've made a series on in last year for the 700th year of his death, where especially in the first video about his life and times, we have actually illustrated great part of this, mostly from Dante's, that is a Florentine perspective, that was increasingly important because Tuscany was quickly rising as a protagonist in the scenario, because in the previous centuries it had remained relatively less developed than Lombardy. It hadn't had the same degree of political and military development. At this time, instead, the Tuscan cities were booming and were becoming kind of a cradle of Guelphism, because Lombardy was more aristocratic in tone, in temper, whereas Tuscany was more kind of democratic in tone and temper. This would remain a bit like the paradigm, Milan and Florence, like tyranny and the Republic, respectively. But also in Tuscany there were many lords and many Ghibellines, as a matter of fact. We didn't say in Florence. So many famous episodes in words that were, actually still quite primitive from our point of view. I would argue that the real modern thinking does emerge in times like the early 14th century. Also thanks to figures like Dante, like Villani, that really open to modern thinking in the world, in a completely different view of telling reality, etc. At this times, universal ideals were still pretty much not just believed but lived, right? The idea of being a knight and serving the emperor or the church, and having this greater role and sense of honor, and of they would, as we have seen, spill blood consistently. There were massive distractions, radical violence at all levels of these communities, and this was rough, right? In ways that again did boost the necessity of creating a more functional system, which the Italians were basically managing to. So it's obvious that, yes, there was kind of a obvious political recognition in terms of Guelph and Ghibelline, right? There is really no context where you can't really say exactly what we're talking about. Every side was, every individual, every guild, every university was called to take a side specifically. So of course there were many swings, because there could be changes, there could be dramatic overturns, right? And this is especially evident, after the great battles of, think about even just the collapse of the Hohenstaufen in general. That changed a big deal of things. But in general, these two sides are very well recognizable and identified, and people really do belong and believe to them. Right, so this is being called by somebody like a kind of a feudal anarchy or something. There is nothing more incorrect of defining this, first of all, as a feudal thing, because there was a feudality here, but there was also much else. And secondly, it was not anarchic at all. As a matter of fact, these were some of the most regulated and disciplined and organized communities in the entire Europe, and that's the reason why they were so damn active and aggressive. And there were huge fortunes at stake, because controlling these city-states meant to control the largest capitals in Europe. And you understand why this thing was so internationally intertwined. Well, again, there would be a constant negotiation across the Alps between France, Germany, Italy, because whatever happened, even in a single city of these, meant everything. There is, by Finca, the collection of the Acta Aragonensia that are from basically the same years, like the 13th and 14th century. Is a collection of all the Aragonese letters of the time. The Iberian monarchies have an early, control. The written records that is, for historians is really a big deal. And you realize that James of Aragon himself basically had a spy in every single freaking, and more than one actually, in every single freaking Italian city. And for each of these cities, he wanted to know everything. We have all the list. Who were the most powerful individuals there, what they did, what side they were, right? And we know this. At the time of Barbarossa, there were Byzantine spies everywhere. There were French spies everywhere, there were German spies everywhere, because, again, every single political change in Italy, which happened all the freaking time. Let's say, if you read the chronicles, every year, at least 2 or 3 cities were changing regime, in a way or not, and war was revolving around them, and that would change in the following years, was crucial in terms of political and strategic balance, right? And so, especially if you're a German emperor, and you want to make a Raumfahrt, and you need that support, like, you need these cities you have to cross Italy to be supported, to be safe, to be steady, right? Equally for the Angevins that are, they have their hands literally everywhere in the Mediterranean. If one of their cities in northern Italy or in Tuscany is being, is rebelling, or there is some, coalition that is waging war, they have to intervene, by the way. This is something which happened very often. In fact, the Neapolitans were often called, especially by Florence and the Guelph that was becoming after Tagliacozzo, especially the capital of Guelphism, properly was the necessary to be controlled. Right, this would go on up to the time of Henry VII and beyond, actually, because Florence was always Guelph, and there were simply things that you could not afford to lose. Right? People at the time understood much better international politics than we do today. And don't think that it was easier at the time, right? And also because it's not much about the degree of complexity that you would say maybe the world is more complex today. Well, it's also more control in a way, but it's the fact that wherever you lived, you could be literally involved in a war, right? You were not spared because it was normal, right? You would breathe war like it was like another thing. And you would see it with your own eyes, and you would have necessary to take part to it. So also any delusional pacifistic mentality was, of course, completely alien from medieval civilization for good reasons in the first place, right? Which doesn't mean that you don't want to pursue peace, which was the ultimate goal for everybody. Just read Dante, etc. Now, and again, it was useful, given that these alliances were well defined, albeit they were floating in a sense. It was obvious that, I don't know, for the Angevins, it was easy to realize, who was from their side or not, right? There was a Guelph bloc in a way, and for a German emperor also the same thing. There was a Ghibelline bloc they could rely on, and it was obvious. I mean, there are some continuities, right? There are some cities that were more more prone to change, especially if they were smaller. Others were more traditionally from one side or the other, and therefore also their regime change could be a big deal, right? I don't know. Think about Milan. That was by far the most important northern Italian city. Well, that had generally speaking, it was pro-Guelph at the beginning. That it would have the Visconti parenthesis, then again the Torriani one, and then it would come back Ghibelline with the Visconti again in 14th century. So it's it was obvious that also for changing the course, say, of this alliance, you had to point on the most important of these cities, right? And so that was the most important goal. And naturally, there weren't just the Guelph and the Ghibelline alliance. As a matter of fact, for the Guelphs especially, it's very famous and confirming the fact that they were kind of more less ideologically oriented than the Ghibellines, that instead had a more firm ideology, an imperial one ideology that was a big deal to refer to. The Guelphs were more like, so, like, yeah, we are against the emperor, rather than being for the Pope, or for even less for the French. And this division is mostly famously expressed by Dante himself, who was a white Guelph that factually came to be a Ghibelline. But this was a split that had formed in Tuscany, between starting from minor places and then spreading across the entire, mostly Tuscan Guelphism. But it was a big deal because, where it wasn't, it was being Ghibelline, given that at some point the blacks took over. So most of these white Guelphs, took refuge among the Ghibellines. So that's the moment of major, say radicalization. But even just at the beginning, it's not quite the same to be, Ghibelline or white Guelph. Also because ideologically and in theory, there are more moderate views, for example, relatively to the empire, especially in that case, and so there were also lots of other leagues, right? The same Lombard League was not, it was the color fundamentally that the hegemonic power that was Milan basically at this point would take. Right, Milan at this point grows further in Lombardy, taking over our cities. So if Milan was under the Ghibellines, it would become kind of the Lombard League would become kind of a Ghibelline thing, and vice versa with Guelphs. Also, were simply normal alliances. At some point, for example, the Tuscan Guelphs formed the so-called Taglia, which was again with like the Lombard League. Basically, they would put in common. Actually, at that point, mostly money, because the monetization of military service was increasing, and as we've seen, the Tuscans were a bit more bourgeois and gentrified than the Lombard lords, and they would put together quite an impressive force. I mean, we're talking about forces, tens of thousands of professionals, by the way, and there would be lots of other alliances. There would be just, there was the feudality too in the Apennine. It was kind of a bit rougher, primitive. They lived a bit more like feudal lords, and they had connections with the cities all the time. There is a divide in this regard. You do understand there are these great lineages, sometimes of very old origin, some of them probably also of Germanic origin. They cared about that, even though maybe it was not true, but still the fact that they were the holder feudality or nobilities would be most likely Ghibellines, right? And sometimes you see that there was the ambiguity, because of course everybody was Christian at the time, so nobody said like, if I'm Ghibelline, I'm not like for the Roman Church. Everybody was. It's just that in practice they could say, I don't know, that the Pope was an heretic in that instance, or that they were actually faithful to the Church and they didn't understand why the Church was harassing them, all these kind of things. But it's very fascinating to look at. And generally speaking, given that the city was the center of power, and that basically every country, every part of the country was under a city in a way or another, and you know that the Italian city-states have this prerogative of literally taking over the surrounding country, right? Unlike any other commune in Europe, and reigning from there, because the feudality was, because the cities were simply more important there, and the feudality weaker as a consequence. There was an enormous effort to erode the same country base of the commune, right? As we've seen, the Italian cities were at the center of this older Roman Carolingian districts, dioceses, etc. They were fundamentally, since ancient times, having this space for each city. It was also pretty close to one another. I mean, we're talking about few tens of kilometers very often. So consider this also from a political and strategical point of view, right? You have an enemy that is a powerful enemy, by the way, and it lives quite close to you all the time. So at this point, seasonal warfare was surpassed, right? They made war, of course, more preferably in the good season, but let's say the resources invested in war were so many, and the world situation was so unstable that everything was going on all the time, right? The objective was to essentially to fuel resistance to the city in its own district, right? And this was easy because, of course, also the nobility that lived in the city had its own power based in the countryside. Of course, the cities themselves, I mean, the citizens themselves had lands all around the city and beyond. And the nobility, traditionally also the one of rural origin, a bit more of feudal origin, it had traditionally urbanized in Italy, had retained, however, their own large possessions in the countryside. And of course, these Italian cities differed a bit in the measure in which they, if anything, in size, in the type of. There were areas that were hyper urbanized, and they had, even the countryside were kind of very anciently brought under the city. Like the case of the biggest ones, like Milan or Florence. But other areas like Piedmont, for example, or northeastern Italy, or also part of the Apennine, actually, were traditionally like less urbanized, or at least they therefore the feudal nobility in the countryside was more powerful, right? And or the cities were smaller, right? Consider this: there were many. We talk mostly of these 30 cities because we talk literally about the civitas, like in a Roman sense, but there were many other communes, like even there were some village communities, peasants, etc., that had sometimes their own thing to say along the Alpine valleys or the Apennine. They were quite warlike mountaineers that very often, in fact, sold their own service in the lowlands for their roughness, etc., and not differently from other places in Europe. And for this reason, it was quite easy when, let's say, a faction expelled another from the city, that the nobles were expelled, still had castles in the countryside, and therefore from there, from the same city district, and from there they could essentially carry out guerrilla against the commune. And given that these districts were all close to one another, it's obvious that the enemy cities would constantly support that resistance. And this was a plague because literally the city's wealth relied on a pacified countryside, right? The Italian city-states did control the countryside at large, but let's say they never fully controlled it, right? Because there was always some, even if they were at peace, right, leaving aside brigands or things like this, but properly, maybe there were just, a feudal lineage there that historically had maintained its own prerogatives there, and the commune simply accepted that. But if that house kind of radicalized politically and decided from one day to another to attack, the supply lines of the city, well, that was a freaking problem. And try to, dislodge a house, a noble house that has, 20 castles in the countryside, right? In the warfare of the time, you have to launch an expedition for each castle individually and to besiege it and to storm, and they would do it, by the way. It's just that they are many at a time, like it takes years, and in years, who knows what can change. Right, these are, if, let's presume, a city in Lombardy that was having this problem. Maybe they were carrying this policy out of reconquest of the countryside. Maybe, they were allied with Milan. The Milanese regime changed. They were at war with Milan at that point, and Milan would immediately back the rebels, and they, at that point, would have even started to raid itself with the Milanese army in your district, and the whole thing would have jumped. And once you destroy, you raise things like entire farms, cultivations to the ground, etc. These are not times which you can regrow things quickly. The enemy will entrench in other castles easily there. They will keep attacking you, and they will keep having the countryside, and the whole city will collapse, because politically speaking, people will not want to pay more taxes, because like today you don't want to pay more gas for supporting Ukraine, and you're an idiot, by the way. And for the same reason, in fact, these cities would lose their own independence quite meaningfully in that way. They would be taken over by other powers. And it's the history of how the seigneuries took over from a strategic point of view. And so this thing went on all the freaking time, right? So you can understand how messed up it was just to manage situations like this. And of course, not only this is true for one city, but for multiple cities at a time. So imagine, ideally, 15 Italian cities versus other 15 that are doing this all the time, right? In the quite complicated, also Italian territory that in general is quite articulated. So it was terrifying, because the political military activity was constant on the base properly of regime change and overthrowing. That was the greatest thing. By the way, these cities were powerful enough, as we've seen, especially when they were coalized, but let's say they would rarely do things like besieging each other, right? It was rare. The bigger ones could do it, was mostly even in there ravaging the countryside, etc. But the preferred way to actually, as always, solve the problem was regime change, which meant a lot of coups in the cities that strengthened, as we were saying before, also in turn, for example, the police, the authority. There was a process of disarmament. Also, if you think about the rise of mercenaries, this was done also by the regimes to say, okay, well, let's not have lots of armed people in the city. They would start confiscating arms. They would essentially create a monopoly on the artillery, because literally, like, private people had things like catapults in their own backyard. And this is all documented, by the way. And so, yeah, if you have, like, in the main square some angry mob that is starting to throw crossbow bolts, etc., you take out the large ballistas and you start firing on them. Well, that's quite interesting. Now, this, again, would also go on all the time. As we were saying before, there were deeper characterizations that these conflicts took, aside from being Guelph or Ghibelline. For example, the noble versus people thing, which is also pretty complicated, because essentially the middle classes, as we've seen, had increased in power. And since the end of the 12th, the beginning of the 13th century, they had tested their relevance on the battlefield, as we were saying before. Think about Legnano and showed the infantry power. So this was quite dangerous for the same knights in the cities when they came home. And this would bring to the creation of the popolo that initially there is a first generation along that time that were literally like more the commoners. In the second half of the 13th century, the popolo has become something else. It has become actually a parastatal reality. Like, literally, they had their own elite, their own knights, their own bureaucracy, etc. It was big, and it was taking over the communes in many places. This was naturally negotiated with the elite, with the knights, etc. But in many instances, as we'll see now, many of the knights were expelled, contributing to that exile mechanism that I was telling about before, also in the countryside, so that it was never over in a way. But many knights also sided with the people at that point, because the people would become fundamentally the most common regime in Italy, so much that even the lordships later on would actually be known as people's lordships, because it was the same people who ruled the commune who said, okay, let's call a guy that brings order a little bit with let's give them, in fact, they would maintain the entire control of the civil administration. We would just entrust them the command of the army during war, right? Which it's not that they gave him an army, like they were the same citizens that didn't want this guy to take over. But gradually, of course, these individuals would become importantly powerful and manage also to. This was a consensual thing largely, right? These individuals were given properly extra power because the people wanted that, right? So consider it, and especially in times of war, that was actually just necessary, right? It's just that the entire kind of balance sometimes kind of was exceedingly shifted towards the personal private power of this guy. In other cases, it was a more virtuous thing, and this does mix with the Guelph and Ghibelline stuff, because as we were saying before, largely the most successful seigneuries were Ghibelline, and even in those countries, in those cities that were ruled by the people, with a lord that would call a lord, generally speaking, the most effective, efficient, also from a military point of view, this is the case of Pisa, by the way, were Ghibelline, right? And so you can't overlap kind of the two things, but in part, approximately, you can. In fact, as we were saying before, there were noblemen among the people, because, by the way, this is also quite important, that historically in the Italian communes, the nobility was measured through census, not through blood, right? There were, as we were saying before, some ancient lineages that literally descended from the older ones appointed by, the Carolingians, the Ottonians. There were actual nobility of blood. But, and generally speaking, these more powerful individuals in the cities were maybe, I don't know, and descending from ancient knights or things. Even the Alighieri of Dante were saying of have been of German origin, etc. It was this sense still of that past of Germanic rule and the Romance populace, etc. So at least it was an ideal that lived, in fact, in Ghibellinism pretty much for that reason. And it was a ferocious divide also ethically, right? But the actual nobility would be defined by wealth, right? If you were wealthy enough, you had the duty and the privilege at the same time to fight on horseback for the commune, which meant that you had all some advantages that initially during the consular government, so the one previously to the podestas, so previously to the time you were talking about, were again, as we were saying, were paid by extra money by the community. They had monopolized effectively the communal magistracies, right? So they would do more or less whatever they wanted. At this point was different because there were enough rich people even among the people, the popular, right? So there were knights of Popo that, tendentially speaking, people say, well, they were a bit less kind of warlike than the other knights, but factually they were pretty much the same. It's just that they were often coming, yes, from different backgrounds, but generally speaking, they would use their wealth mostly also to send somebody else to fight for them, sometimes at least. And this is also mixed because the people also fought, and they fought like hell, actually, even in campaigns outside the city. It's just that they were constitutively different from the ultra elite, knightly elite, right? And in fact, there is a tendency within the same popular families, let's call it in this way, to imitate the military guilds. Communal Italy had this reminiscence of the ancient Romano-Germanic war bands of, sworn allegiance to this kind of group, to the clan devotion in the military sense, where the band of Arthur, the band of the Wolf, right? So all these ancestral, sects almost, that they had their own code, their own extremely brutal lifestyle, and it would be literally like the young men. It was like the ancient war bands, right? These young men were sent out there in the world to do the worst kind of business to gain glory, fame, wealth, and the best way was marrying a rich widow, and the Italian literature at the time is present all this way. But these guys were also, the prevalent was with French chivalric literature and the exaltation of military ethos and ideals. So it was quite fitting with the with a violent tone of the time. Yet, at the core, there is some kind of social meaning in these struggles that indeed have to do with the emancipation of the middle classes from the military elite. This is indeed true, right? Mostly in the end of the 13th century, this would take the shape not much of a class struggle that was what fueled, indeed, in part, the early grievances, the early instances and protests against the elite, and broke the system, managed to bring the people in power. But this people was again essentially stratified, aristocratizing in a sense. So think about the priors, the elderly. All these titles were attributed to the various councils of the people that were chosen in part by the arts, in part by the the quarters or the sextiers, or whatever were organized like, which meant that, of course, there was some elite, there was some aristocracy within the same people, and these were mostly what would be known as the fat of the fat people. That is the merchants, the bankers, those who had really the money, the assets, and were also literally having the land and control and clienteles and retinues and all these things. And the people had organized, as we were saying before, in a paramilitary sense, with the captain that was in fact recruited by the same from the same group of the knights that at this point roamed the various cities in search of employment. Right, that exiling mechanism had increased definitely professionalism in that sense, because they knew how to make war. And they definitely did pretty well. So these guys had the money, as we've seen. They could hire them, and it would keep control of the same mob, right? So that's also how the gradual certification increased. And also because, as you know, the technical dimension of war at this point, by the end of the 30s, it's kind of developing fast, right? Armor is getting heavier, so are the mounts. There are, at this point, these communes start maintaining some important amount of salaried crossbowmen, sharpshooters in important fashion. So the war starts becoming a much tougher business. The Italians developed at this point actually their tactics that they are 40 years ahead. For example, the English armies of the at least very consistent. We're talking about thousands of infantry on the wings of the cavalry line. They would kind of channel the fight between cavalries from the sides and kind of attack each other and then fall on the enemy on the cavalry sides if they managed to break. These were highly specialized crossbowmen, pikemen, also equipped with heavy axes. Things are really pretty anti-cavalry stuff. But still, by the way, with still orderly under the cavalry, right? So this is very important for the Italian warfare, because it shows that after all, the elites were powerful enough, even in spite of the greatest absolute development of infantry in Europe, still to maintain these infantries under, right? And to actually make them cooperate, because the people's seigneury would actually mean this thing, that the people accepted itself to be under that lord. And so this stratification was reflected also in the military organization. And the captain of the people, so the people paramilitary were normally were some thousand troops that were called at least to guard the city from the within. Then of course there was the general exercitus, the army, to which basically everybody could participate, even though it happened in a rota system. But this is for saying that, of course, the people could serve in much larger numbers in campaign, right? Not just in this paramilitary tool that was invented just to maintain control in the city streets and squares. And the captain would, essentially associate with the podestà. It was this mostly military leader called by the communes to put order in observation of the communal statutes and everything. Sometimes the captain of the people even substituted the podesta, which was pretty radical. I mean, there were some cities that were more radical than others, like Florence, Bologna were hardcore Guelphs in this sense, because we're kind of hardcore popular in nature. And so that's where the people kind of maintained for longer its own institutions. The signory didn't make it, at least, in part to rule. And so this popular movement that, as you understand, is pretty big. It can't be said like these are the commoners. They are not anymore, right? They are something else. They are nobility themselves. But they were still opposed, in the conventional language, to, in fact, what was known as the pars nobilium, that is the sign of the nobleman. And so to the class of the noblemen, of the great, as they called them, that is the magnates, that was a pretty hypocritical way to call basically everybody who was, attempting to take over the commune's government autocratically, individually, as a lord, as a tyrant, or at least in a way that was annoying the people enough to essentially to have them wanted and very often expelled, and their possessions in the city seized or razed to the ground, etc. Consider that this nobleman had literally entire fortified quarters, were like entire castles on their own, right? They were quite impressive. There were ferocious urban battles taking place that were devastating. And there is, in the second half of the 13th century, definitely a radicalization of the popular instances, right, from the previous generation that had been initially, in fact, about this, recognition of greater prerogatives or equal prerogatives, at least to one of the magnates, that eventually turned into an anti-magnate legislation that is all aimed at excluding from every responsibility the greats, the magnates, whatever they call them, the powerful, that were deemed as such independently from the social origins of the family. So much, again, that there were many old militia knights within the popular ranks, while maybe there was a popular nobleman that had emerged and then now was expelled because was deemed to be too dangerous or too annoying, too inconvenient for the commune at that point. And so this system will strengthen further. Like, it started surely in very violent ways, but definitely the process of statalization of power, of centralization, of greater also military development, greater military organization properly, and greater management of the city and functional sense would occur under the people, and especially in the end of the 13th, the beginning of the 14th century, really reached the top of this power, and also in fact in the top of war, as we will see in another video. But again, I think that this topic is really important because it's very it's very specific. Like, you can't really describe it simply because it's the whole deal of the thing. Nothing is simple there, and as most things in history, but here more, because the system is bigger, is more concentrated, is larger, right? At this point, 1/4 of Europeans are Italian, demographically speaking. So just think about the literal demographic concentration, for not talking about the wealth one, that is taking place here, and it's huge, right? And that's why it's stupidly overlooked, because again, if you don't know this chapter of medieval history, you can hardly understand basically anything of it at the time. But again, this is the giant complex. Given that this was not a kingdom, or there was not a dynasty, where it's too complicated or too strange or too, like, I don't know, this things were too, I don't know, we don't consider them. You should really consider them, because again, if you want to have a serious medieval history knowledge. Otherwise, keep getting lost in I don't know what, but at least we are talking about it. And so my hope is that these topics will spread at some point, as many others that we discuss here, because the Middle Ages are not really an opinion, or at least they tend to be for us when we study it. in our lifetime. But let's say when again you look at the popular thing, how people approach the Middle Ages, it's as if the Middle Ages factually did not exist. Like in popular culture, you can assert today that nobody actually has a clear idea of what this is, what this means, and the reasons why people approach the Middle Ages are the most varied, except the actual historical ones. And this is disgusting. Like it's for most history, but I think the Middle Ages is the era that has the greatest problem historically and culturally from this point of view. We know why in general, but still, what surprises me is, like, we know, like, these things have been written about, and of course I know that I can explain the mechanism of why people don't know about them, but at the same time, it's like if you make an effort to even know a minimal thing about this thing, you encounter that kind of historiography. So this means that there is literally no historical attempt to learn anything whatsoever. And then there are those topics we're just seeing right now, like today's one, that people don't even understand, because again, objectively they're more complex and difficult, but they're also more important. So what's the moral criterion here? Like, what's the entire point of knowing anything at that point? In any case, we will keep talking about Guelphs and Ghibellines. We're really so much to tell. I was glad in November, December to make all those manual, basic manual videos about also the passage of, the end of the Swabians, the Angevins, because those are things that people don't study either, because I don't know why. That's, again, literally some of the most important thing ever, but, how many people study Manfred or Charles of Anjou or Conradin and realize that those are literally the single most important, even militarily speaking, they were taking place in Europe at the time. I mean, the Italian warfare at this point is, Benevent, Tagliacozzo, Montaperti, Campaldino. These are the largest battles that are fought there in medieval Europe. And again, if you miss this part, it's quite difficult to basically know anything again about medieval warfare, because those are literally some of the most defining battles in medieval history. So in any case, I stopped my ramble for today. Hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. Have a nice time and see you next time. Bye.